This is the Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan, a man-made abyss that the Soviets, in their quest for oil, accidentally opened in the Karakum desert as a result of a gas leak. A crater that since 1971 has been engulfed in flames without ever extinguishing for a single day.
So, Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is a mix of contrasts, of beauty and mess.
This is what you can find online when you search for Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is one of the most remote and inaccessible land in the world. It's a forgotten nation, not to mention its history.
What's its capital? Don't look on Wikipedia. I give you 3 seconds to answer. Ashgabat. You got it? Awesome! You're going to Gulag as a reward.
What many of you might not know is that Turkmenistan was and is still today one of the most unusual dictatorships ever.
But let me explain how they got there. It's history time.
Turkmenistan isolation needs to be seen in its geopolitical context. The country is bordered to the south by Iran and Afghanistan, to the north by Kazakhstan, to the northeast by Uzbekistan, and to the west by the Caspian Sea. The Karakum Desert dominates almost all of the country, about 90% of the territory, while in the south a series of mountain ranges form a natural border with Iran and Afghanistan. In the north, the border with Uzbekistan is partly divided by the Darya River, one of the most important water resources in Central Asia. Turkmenistan's river valleys have sustained its civilization since ancient times. Although the region was dominated for many centuries by Turkmen tribes, Turkmenistan as a political entity only emerged in the last century. During the Soviet period, the country was an underdeveloped socialist republic. For the Soviets, Turkmenistan served as a supplier of raw materials, starting from raw cotton fiber, oil and natural gas, its main resources. For the rest, the country was supported by the meager economic aid from the USSR. In boosting cotton production, there was an intense development of the irrigation system, which, however, produced very serious damage to the surrounding environment. The flow of the Darya was redirected to the main desert farms. These only contributed to the drying up of the Aral Lake on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, an environmental disaster that, among other things, fueled disagreements among Central Asian nations over the consumption of natural resources and waterways.
With the end of subsidies, the fall of the Soviet Union and the country's independence in 1991, pretty much everything non-related with the gas industry went bankrupt.
Unemployment arose, among the highest in the world, more than 60%, and this led the country to export gas at competitive prices in order to face the hegemony of Russia in the area.
Once independent, Turkmenistan began celebrating a policy of neutrality.
This monument in Ashgabat was the symbol of such neutrality and served the government as a way to create favorable diplomacy with its Central Asian neighbors. Hopefully, this tower was also created to attract the attention of foreign investors. Turkmenistan, after all, needed money.
That's basically what everyone needs, come on.
It needed money to revitalize the gas industry and establish an emirate state, just like Kuwait did before. With approximately 2.7 trillion cubic meters of natural gas reserves, Turkmenistan was in fact the second largest producer in the former Soviet Union and is currently the 9th largest producer globally.
A share that could let Turkmenistan achieve incredible economic development in an ideal world.
However, after independence, the government of Turkmenistan was never eager to implement serious reforms, for example by liberalizing prices and allowing a real private sector to emerge. Despite some improvements in recent years, a large part of the population still lives below the poverty line, and the economy is fragile and stagnant, contrary to the claims of the country's former president for life, the so-called Turkmenbashi, a title which means literally "father of all Turkmens." According to Turkmenbashi and his annual reports, the national growth rate was 20% in August 2006.
I smell something rotten in here.
Based on the official versions, the president died of a heart attack a few months later. According to others, he was poisoned. What's certain is that he had no way of appreciating the benefits that this alleged 20% growth rate would have had on the country.
But the real question is, who's Saparmurat Niyazov, aka Turkmenbashi, and why is he so important for all of us? Well, maybe not all of us. Was he a megalomaniac dictator? A liar, a madman in power, a shrewd calculator who leveraged national symbolism?
But he is not a porn star!
To answer these questions, all it takes is a simple yes. Let's see why.
Every single year on September 12, the citizens of Turkmenistan gather to celebrate Runama Day, the national holiday honoring the Runama, literally the Book of the Soul, a work of spiritual teachings addressed to the nation and written by the president himself.
Or by one of his fellow ghostwriters. But never say never. Niyazov was a poet, after all, and a dictator.
In 2002, in the capital Ashgabat, a massive statue of the book was raised, and every evening at 8 o'clock, the cover was raised and opened to the public. In the main square, an audio recording of some passages, together with a video projected on the page of the book, was broadcasted. Building huge statues was one of Turkmenbashi's main obsessions. Even better if these huge statues were covered in gold and were dedicated to him.
And recently also to his dog. Yep.
This fixation was so strong that Turkmenbashi imposed that they were spread in all the cities of the nation. Referring to this obsession, Niyazov repeatedly stressed that it wasn't due to reasons of megalomania, but simply because it was the Turkmen people who wanted them all over the country.
Reverse psychology at its finest.
Another interesting case of Niyazov mentality was the New Year's Eve of 1999, when every citizen of Ashgabat was given a watch with a picture of the president himself.
Our dear Berlusconi did the same in Italy in 1999 when he gave us a calculator to calculate the euro-lira exchange rate. I see no difference at all.
Niyazov's strange policies served as a way to emphasize the Turkmen national symbolism, to the point that many foreign commentators described Turkmenistan under Niyazov as a fascist state inserted in a post-Soviet space. Niyazov transferred Soviet ideology to secure the narrative of a Turkmen national superiority. In his Runama, Niyazov argued that Turkmen national development began more than 5,000 years ago, and, as he said, Turkmenistan can now live separate and isolated from other states while maintaining its traditions and customs. This was the turning point for Turkmenistan, when it began to look more like North Korea than Russia. In every place, the words and the most striking quotations of the glorious leader, as he was called, were inscribed on walls, plates and billboards.
A series of great public monuments exalted his virtues. Cities, dams, roads, libraries and schools, all named and built in his honor. Knowledge of the main chapters of Runama was demanded not only from government officials, but also from ordinary people.
For instance, people were required to repeat some of the Runama quotes when taking the driving license test. To ensure that Turkmen would not lose sight of their glorious leader in their daily activities, Turkmenbashi invented another way to remind citizens of his presence. He declared that every month of the year should be renamed. January was named Turkmenbashi in his honor, while April was named in memory of his mother, Gurban Sultan.
Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but in Turkmenistan, worshipping family members was and still is in fact one of the hallmarks of the regime, much more than in other neighboring countries.
Before becoming known as Turkmenbashi and as the spiritual father of the country, Niyazov was one of the many faceless, grey and anonymous local party bureaucrats, a staunch supporter of the Soviet ideology in Turkmenistan. Yet, as the union unraveled, Niyazov switched political flags, shifting surprisingly quickly in favor of Turkmen nationalism. A case in point was when, at the end of the last formal meeting of the party, after lunch, Niyazov gathered the same members in the same hall to found the Democratic Party of Turkmenistan.
We are the Communist Party. Oh, never mind. We are not the Communist Party anymore.
By consolidating control over all aspects of society, economy and government, Turkmenbashi exploited what remained of the skeleton of the Soviet system to create a political machine based on constraint, fear, nepotism and patronage. In taking advantage of the weakness of what was considered a de facto country made up of tribal chief and herding clans, Turkmenbashi installed a hybrid system where, quote-unquote, traditional elements of tribal society were combined with modern elements of the typical Soviet power hierarchy.
But how was it that Niyazov, a single man, was able to take control of Turkmenistan by himself? Well, one single word can be enough. Monopolization. Monopolization of the country's vast reserves of natural gas, from which Turkmenistan didn't benefit at all during the Soviet period.
By extracting and shipping gas through the pipelines to Russia, The country earned meager revenues from the sale of its primary commodity. Niyazov exploited the nationalization of gas and took control of all the industrial plants. But sadly for the population, the brokerage companies that operated on his behalf would have done nothing but commercialize Turkmen gas and channel the revenues into the president's bank accounts. Revenues that served as his main source of income.
To give a semblance of general economic improvements, Turkmenbashi undertook a series of daring state projects. This was done to consolidate his consensus among a population that, at that time, do remember, registered a high illiteracy.
The capital Ashgabat, from an underdeveloped village, became a showcase for foreign investors, made of majestic public buildings in white marble, sumptuous parks, and wide streets, which are still today almost empty. Water scarcity was a daily issue, and yet more than 1,000 fountains were built. Behind the glittering facade of public buildings, Turkmenistan remained a country marked by isolation, poverty, and the systematic suppression of freedom of speech. The only applicable law was that of Niyazov himself, who, besides controlling the information and media, deprived courts and parliamentary institutions of their power.
Niyazov justified the absence of pro-democratic reforms due to what he called the Turkmen mentality. That is, a mentality that was at odds with pro-Western democracy.
Niyazov banned everything that was not part of the Turkmen culture. These included video games, car radios, makeups, ballet and opera, long hair and beards for men, and last but not least, dogs. Because according to him, when walking down the streets of the capital, dogs gave off a bad smell.
Turkmenistan became a sort of big brother managed by a single man.
The term bread was changed to his mother's name. Doctors, instead of swearing to Hippocrates, swore to him. The Cyrillic alphabet was replaced with the Turkmen alphabet, similar to the Latin one, and any exam could be passed only after passing a morality test as well. Oh, yeah, and among other extravagances, Niyazov suggested to the old people to chew chicken bones, a bit like dogs do, saying that in this way they would avoid all dental problems.
Who needs implants anyway?
Contributing to the isolation was the systematic dismantling of school, libraries and cultural clubs. After all, it's much easier to keep control over an ignorant and uneducated population, isn't it? The mass media and even the police force were corrupted with bribes. As stated by a journalist who fled the country, for the past 12 years, Turkmenbashi plunged the country into a neo-Stalinist nightmare. Although the country had adopted shortly after independence a constitution conforming to international standards, it didn't actually have the basic structure to defend any single civil liberties.
Basically, the constitution became just scrap paper that Turkmenbashi punctually reshaped at his own will. Another nice aspect of Niyazov were his big lies.
By exaggerating the country's progress and insisting that Turkmen citizens were lucky to live in a country with advanced freedoms and privileges, Niyazov exalted and justified not only his own position as the country father's defender, but also his attacks on anyone who questioned the country's progress. Attacks that were condemned as accusations made by supporters of foreign powers, whether it be American, Russian or European.
Niyazov repeatedly said that Turkmenistan was free of crimes of any kind and that no rights had ever been violated in the country.
In November 2002, however, following an assassination attempt against him, the president seized the opportunity to cast suspicion on some ministers who were openly against him, including the ex-foreign minister Boris Shikmuradov. Niyazov also accused the Uzbek minority in the country and the Uzbek government of being involved in the matter.
A way to highlight, once again at the expense of the Uzbek minority, how special Turkmens were.
Support to Niyazov came from those who ran the country's key sectors, namely the energy, banking and agricultural sectors. Corruption and political compromise did the rest.
It was either unconditional loyalty to the great leader or elimination.
As Niyazov often declared in his public rallies, there was no opposition in Turkmenistan.
I think we should trust him and not see this as a subtle threat.
The country's predominant religion itself, Islam, had to pass through the filter of propaganda. In one of the sessions of the People's Council, Niyazov proclaimed himself as the new Prophet Muhammad.
He went even beyond when he claimed that his book, Runama was the equivalent of the Quran.
According to Niyazov, whoever read the Runama aloud 3 times a day would go straight to heaven. As you can well understand, Islam underwent a strong ideological control in order to limit its potential impacts on the population. Islam could have been an alternative choice and potentially a political means to foster opposition.
After all, what's the point of reading Quran when you already have Runama?
By the time Niyazov passed away, the country was in a pitiful state, with the economy completely paralyzed, lacking internal and external investments, with the gas and oil route at stake between Russia and China, with no monetary aid either from the big international funds or from domestic bank insurances. With the new president Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow, there has been a very small change of direction.
Oh, yeah, I see.
There are still big inequalities. Think of the average salaries. An average Turkmen don't get more than $20 per month.
And that's the sad reality of Turkmenistan. We'll probably have to wait a long time before one of the most famous quotes from Runama can come true for real. Our country is not only for the Turkmen people, but for all those people who want to lead Turkmenistan into a golden century.